Hello, and welcome back to Apolitical, a weekly podcast where we bring Atlanta politics to you unfiltered. I'm your host, Ms. Cameron T., and welcome back. Today, we'll be sitting down with District 2 City Councilman Amir Farokhi. I'm very excited for this conversation because Mr. Farokhi recently introduced legislation to hire an Atlanta night mayor. Of course, we had to ask him what exactly a night mayor is and who he has his eye on for the job. So don't go anywhere. Coming right up is our interview with District 2 City Councilman Amir Farokhi. Stay tuned. The holidays are coming up. If you're anything like me, you are tired of those same old Hallmark cards that you get at the grocery store every year, which is why I want to tell you guys about Neighborly Paper. Neighborly Paper is a Black and woman-owned greeting card company based right here in Atlanta. They have the most stunning and hilarious cards on the market. They have cards for every occasion, including Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, birthdays, graduations, the holidays, astrological events, all those good things. They are so different from anything else on the market, so you have to check them out. You can find them by heading over to neighborlypaper.com right now. Stock up and bring a smile to those special people in your life. All right, guys, let's get to our interview. And joining us now is Councilman Amir Farokhi. Mr. Farokhi, thanks so much for taking the time to come on Apolitical.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
It is our pleasure. Last month, you proposed legislation to City Council to perform a feasibility study on hiring an Atlanta night mayor. Can you tell us how you came up with this idea and what exactly will this person be doing?
Yeah, I appreciate y'all taking interest in this topic. My office has actually been sitting on this for a few years. This is not a novel idea. It's one that started in Amsterdam in the early 2000s, and many other cities have adopted some form or fashion of this over the last couple of decades. Domestically, Orlando, DC, New York, Detroit, a bunch of cities have some type of person or office that focuses on the nighttime economy or nightlife. It's different in every place. And so that's why I wanted to call on a feasibility study to see what would work best for our city. And the rationale being, quite frankly, is that the nighttime economy, what happens at night in the city, is unique from what happens during the day. And it does not yet have the same level of attention or collaboration and coordination among stakeholders, both within city government, so APD, Department of Transportation, watershed, parks, whatever it may be within the city, but also with stakeholders outside, whether it's bars and nightlife restaurants, the hospitality industry, hotels, arenas, hospitals. There's a lot that happens at night beyond nightlife, but beyond kind of bars and restaurants. And the theory being this type of person would wake up every day or stay up every night thinking about how do we make sure our resources and support is aligned to ensure the nighttime economy is safe, it's quiet where it needs to be quiet, it's loud where it can be loud, but really is flourishing like any big, great global city has, which is something we should be thinking of and working toward.
So I saw you tweeted out that you don't think nightlife in Atlanta is getting enough attention from city officials. Where do you think city government is falling short, and where do you see room for improvement in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at City Hall, and this is a blind spot for a lot of city halls. It's not specific to Atlanta, but I think our first inclination is, it's just bars and restaurants and nightclubs. We got police to deal with the unruly stuff. We got ordinances in place to control things. But, frankly, it's a big part of our economy. And we need to kind of foster it just like we foster the daytime economy. And so I think what that means from the city's side responsibility is thinking through everything like, okay, is the transportation network working in ways that meet the needs of people who are out at night, whether you're a worker or you're out to play? And that could mean, hey, is, do we need to be working closer with MARTA to make sure the bus routes are getting people to and from places they need to go after 11 o'clock at night, for example? Earlier this year, or a couple of years ago, when we had the first onslaught of scooters in the city, the mayor at some point after a couple of deaths said, we're going to cut these off at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And I got a lot of emails from folks saying, hey, I'm a bartender, I work at a hotel, I actually use these scooters to get home or to get to MARTA. This really hurts me. And I think you have someone who's thinking about the nighttime economy, responding to these challenges. You probably could have come up with a solution that made it safe, but also still provided access for folks. So that's one small example. I think, looking at traffic lights, do traffic lights, how they're synchronized during the day, do they need to be synchronized differently at night where we see large swaths of people? Is street lighting where it needs to be? And is there an economic opportunity that we're missing? So for example, are there small business owners that could be thriving at night, whether it's a food truck or a street stall, whatever it may be? Are we fostering an environment in which people can build a business and thrive at night? And that's something that I think other cities have done well that we need to spend more attention on.
So it sounds like the primary goal would be to improve the experience for not only patrons and workers, but also business owners.
Yeah, and residents. I think, I almost think of this person or this office being, at first, kind of a reactive nighttime problem solver, right? Like, what are the issues that are causing friction, whether it's a public safety issue, an economic development. Let's say, folks who run nighttime businesses are having a hard time getting their business licenses approved at the city because, they're sleeping until 2 because they've been working all night. Can we figure out a way to make it easier to run a business at night, right? Those types of things.
So if passed, I imagine this would be quite a sought after position. What type of person do you think would be the best fit for the job? What experiences should they have, and who would actually decide who gets the job?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The term nightmare is kind of a fun, sexy term, I suppose. In other cities, I think DC is called the Office of Nightlife. Other places talk about more the nighttime economy holistically. The nightmare is just an easy way to get people to think about what this role is. Whether this person is called a nightmare or not, so be it. But the way that I envision it, and this is something that the feasibility study would look at, is this person would be appointed and hired by the mayor and sit somewhere in the mayor's office or in the mayor's purview and would report to the mayor. They could report to council, kind of give updates, but ultimately this is someone who would report to the mayor. What does that person look like? What attributes? I think that's something we have to spend time looking at. I'm hoping in the coming months or two, we can invite some folks from other cities who have these departments or individuals and talk to them about what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, what types of skill sets are best.
Since we're talking about nightlife, I have to ask, if Councilman Farokhi is having a night out on the town, where is he going? What bar? What area? Give me all the details.
Oh, man. You're catching me at a time in my life where my nightlife activity has dropped significantly now that I'm married and have a kid. Back, and I'll probably date myself, right? But back in my 20s, I'm 43 now. My 20s, it was a lot of Midtown and West Side clubs and bars. Some East Side, kind of Virginia Highland. But now most of my nightlife include, if I'm out at night, it's usually to a sporting event and not to a nightclub.
Do you have a timeline for when to expect that this may get done and when we could actually see someone in this position?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I'm hoping is that in the next 2 to 4 months, we can get moving with the feasibility study, do some work sessions, and then finish up in, say, February, March, in time to propose part of the next year's fiscal budget to cover this position or positions. So we vote on the fiscal year budget in June of each year, because our fiscal year runs until June 30th and picks up again July 1. So if we can wrap up the feasibility study by March, that gives us April, May, June to hopefully find support on council and in the next mayor's office for a position like this and have a budgetary line item for it.
Well, while I have you here, I do want to ask you about your zoning amendments. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. You also introduced amendments for zoning reform this summer to allow accessory dwelling units on residential properties. Can you explain to our listeners what this legislation aims to accomplish?
Yeah, so the legislation does three things. Only one of them is associated with accessory dwelling units, which I'll explain in a second. All of it is premised on the reality that more people want to live in the city than we have housing. So we have to increase the amount of housing. If not, housing costs continue to increase, whether you're buying, whether you're renting. It's a simple supply and demand problem. We need more housing, frankly, at all price points: low-income housing, middle-income housing, high-income housing. So we got to build more housing. Some of that will come in the form of high rises in Midtown, downtown, Buckhead. But the legislation that I've introduced is intended to increase housing stock at scale in traditional neighborhoods. So think of it as gentle density. So not a 6-story building, but a quadplex or a fourplex or a basement apartment. So the legislation I introduced does three things. One is with accessory dwelling units, which ADUs, as they're commonly called, tiny house. Think of like a small spot out back behind a house. These are permitted through most of the city already. The legislation would allow for attached ADUs, so not a detached building out back, but like a basement apartment or apartment above a garage. You see those around the city, but this would really incent those to happen. The second piece is eliminating the city's requirements for parking for residential properties. So what that means is not that no parking would be built, but instead of the city saying you have to have 120 spaces in a 100-unit apartment building, the developer or builder would determine how many parking spaces are needed. And the reason that is parking is really, really expensive, and that cost gets passed on to renters and to buyers. It's about $20,000 to $40,000 per spot to build a parking deck, to build those spots. So you leave it to the market. I mean, people say, oh, there's going to be no parking. Everyone's going to be parking on my street. False. Lenders are still going to require parking. Tenants are still going to look for places with parking spaces, but you may not have as many, which drives down the cost, which gets passed on to renters and buyers. So that's a lower cost push. And then the final thing is probably the most controversial, but to me, perhaps the most common sense, is rezoning all properties within a half-mile walk of a MARTA station to allow for 1 to 4 units. And that would mean if you're an existing single-family home, you could stay in that single-family home. You could tear down and build a new single-family home. But you could also, if you're in that footprint, build a duplex or a quadplex. If 2 of those units, or 1 of those 4 units, is affordable, and we define affordable, if 1 of those 4 units is affordable, you can build up to 8 units. If 2 of those 4 units are affordable, you can build up to 12 units. So it's really figuring out a way to increase both affordability, but frankly, just housing stock in kind of smaller apartment-style buildings and opportunities for folks.
Okay, so I know there's been some sort of community feedback process taking place with this. How has that been, and where are we at now in that process?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because it gives me an opportunity to say community input is very important. However, our current system, and this happens in every city in the country, it's not specific to Atlanta, but the people who show up to community meetings and to neighborhood meetings are almost all single-family homeowners. They're almost all affluent. And so what you don't have at the table are people who are renting, people who are new to the city, immigrants, people who work in 2 jobs, people who live in townhomes or condos. And so what we get from council, from our neighborhood meetings and NPUs, and it's a valid form of citizen input, is not a full perspective on how folks think about things. And so you tend to get a warped voice in this public policy debate. So it falls on council members, and I think we all take this seriously in our own way, but it falls on council members to think beyond what we may be hearing from a neighborhood association or NPU, because a lot of residents we represent don't reach out to us, and we need to think about their interests as well. And frankly, we're asking people in zoning decisions to make decisions about future residents or new neighbors that don't yet exist, who don't have a voice in the process. This is really, in my opinion, when you talk about upzoning, creating more density, this is about inclusion over exclusion. Because when you say no, you're saying no to people who can't find a place to live in the city. You're driving up housing costs. And I know it's hard, it's emotional, but look, every city is growing and changing, or it's dying, and we're growing and changing. And that doesn't mean you lose everything that's special about the city, but the city's going to look a lot different in 10 years and 20 years than it does today. That's how cities work.
Yes. So are the NPU votes binding, or can you guys still move forward without their approval?
Yeah, MPU votes are advisory, just like a neighborhood. So, they have political weight because I think a lot of folks say, well, these are the people who vote for me. This is who I hear from most. I'm going to do what the MPU wants, which is a politically safe thing to do. But I think in this instance especially, not always, but in this instance especially, when we're talking about how do we fit more people into the city who want to be here, if we don't do that, we really run the risk of increasing inaffordability in the city. We're turning away folks of all backgrounds. We make it harder to be economically competitive. And so that's why I say it's an issue over inclusion over exclusion. People don't like to hear that because they don't like to think of themselves as being exclusive. But when you say, no, I don't want to see a 4-unit building next to my house, you're being exclusive. And this isn't a country club. This is a city.
We've been interviewing city council candidates, and probably the biggest critique of this is that it doesn't guarantee affordable housing.
They always end their presentation with, this will bring about more affordability. No, it will not. You cannot guarantee that. Only thing you're guaranteeing through this zoning is the option for a developer to build more density, more height, but you're not guaranteeing that they cannot charge whatever they want
just
to
because
charge
they're more
for.
apartments.
What do you say about that critique?
Yeah, it's a great question. I get it all the time. So that, look, this is not intended to solve all of our affordable housing problems. Atlanta housing has lots of property it needs to be developing on, low income and senior housing. The Civic Center site's a great example. We're going to continue to see high density development in Midtown, downtown Buckhead, these 10, 20, 30, 40 story buildings. That will continue to happen. This is intended to increase more types of housing stock in kind of that missing middle housing. Now, to your question, saying like, as structured, unless there's like 1 or 2 units in those fourplexes that are affordable, there's no mandate for affordability in this. I would say in response to that, and studies have shown that when you have high housing costs or increasing housing costs, adding housing at any price point, so market rate housing, a luxury apartment building, a townhome that costs $600,000, all of that, when you add it to the market, to the housing market, it still decreases housing costs up and down the housing ladder. The reason being, if I build a 100-unit apartment building and it's market rate, so you're having 1 bedrooms going for, let's just say $1,800 a month. The people who move into that, some of them are going to come from out of town, a lot of people will come from older apartments in the city. And the people who move into those apartments that were just vacated are coming from lower income apartments. So people kind of move up the housing ladder, which frees up apartments all up and down the food chain. So it's not a one-for-one change, but it creates downward pressure on prices in housing. There's been studies done across the U.S. on this as well as in Europe, and the response to that is, even if you add a luxury unit or an at-market unit to the market, if you add enough of them, and you're not tearing down affordable housing to do so, you're building it on an industrial site or it's a new housing ad, you're actually helping out the affordable housing problem.
One more question. Do we have some sort of timeline for when this legislation is going to be voted on by council yet?
So the 3 pieces, we'll probably divide them up. So that the elimination of parking minimums and the accessory dwelling unit, attached accessory dwelling unit piece, we'll hopefully vote on those before the end of the year. That's the goal. The rezoning of properties in the half mile of a MARTA station, which has been the most contentious piece, we will kick that to 2022 and do kind of a neighborhood by neighborhood or footprint by footprint approach for the areas that would be affected, and we'll tackle that next year.
Yes, I would definitely be interested in seeing what the feedback looks like outside of the MPUs.
Yeah, and honestly, we're going to have a new council and looking at the results and seeing some of the runoffs. I'm hopeful we'll have more folks that are pro housing, pro density.
Absolutely. Well, Councilman Farokhi, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on Apolitical. I know you're a busy man, but I truly appreciate it, and I know our listeners do too.
Good to be with you.
Well, guys, that's all we have for you today on this episode of Apolitical. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I am Ms. Cameron T. See you next time. Bye, guys.